planet Ketharai was dying, and everyone on it knew it. For 3 years, the Voraxis swarm had been eating its way through the outer worlds of the Kethrani assembly, not conquering, not occupying, eating. Every colony the swarm touched went silent within days, its cities stripped bare, its people gone, its resources folded into the endless, growing mass of the hive. The assembly had once been proud of its peace. It had built no great armies, because for 400 years, it had needed none. Its member species had settled their disputes with treaties and trade routes, not warships. That peace was now the reason they were losing. On the War Council deck of the flagship Orenthil's Hope, Elder Vashka stood before a wall of dying lights. Each light was a colony. Each one that flickered out meant thousands, sometimes millions of lives folded into the swarm's hunger. Tonight, 3 more lights had gone dark. "We have lost the outer ring," said Fleet Commander Thessa, her voice flat with exhaustion. "The swarm's main body is 2 months from Ketharai itself. Maybe less, if it finds another world to feed on and grows stronger." "And our fleet?" Vashka asked, though she already knew the answer. "What's left of it is falling back to defend the homeworld. We do not have enough ships. We never had enough ships." Thessa's 4 eyes dimmed with something like shame. "We built a civilization on the idea that violence was something other species did. We were wrong to think that made us safe." Vashka turned from the map of dying lights to the ancient archive terminal at the center of the room. It held records of every species the assembly had ever encountered, catalogued and studied across centuries. Most of those species were allies now, bound by treaty and trade. A few were enemies, quarantined behind fleets and warning beacons. And a handful, a very small handful, were something else entirely, species so unpredictable, so capable of violence, that the assembly had chosen never to speak with them at all. "Pull up the Class 7 files," Vashka said quietly. An aide hesitated. "Elder, those files are sealed. Class 7 worlds are marked Do Not Contact for a reason. The species listed there are considered—" "I know what they are considered," Vashka said. "I want to know what they are." The terminal opened a single file. A blue-green world, 3rd from a yellow star, unremarkable in every way except one. The notes attached to it were unusually long and unusually careful. Species designation, human. Homeworld, Earth. Status, unstable. History, violent. Recommendation, no contact under any circumstances. But beneath the warnings, buried in a footnote, written by a long-dead assembly scout, was a single strange observation. The scout had spent 6 months secretly observing Earth from orbit, decades before official contact protocols existed. Her final entry read, "They fight each other more than any species we have ever documented. But when one of their own is trapped, drowning, buried, dying in the cold, they will run toward the danger to save a total stranger, every time, without being asked. I do not understand them. I am afraid of them. I also believe that if we are ever truly desperate, they may be the only ones who will come." Vashka read the words twice. Then she looked at the dying lights on the wall. "Elder," Thessa said carefully. "Protocol forbids." "Protocol was written for a version of us that still believed in tomorrow," Vashka said. "We do not have the luxury of protocol anymore. Open every channel, every frequency. Broadcast our position, our need, and our plea to every species in range, including the quarantined ones. Even Class 7? Especially Class 7. The order rippled through the fleet's remaining communication arrays. Within the hour, a message was being broadcast on every known frequency, translated into every known language, repeated over and over into the dark. "This is the Kethrani Assembly. Our homeworld and billions of our people face annihilation by the Voraxis swarm within weeks. We have no fleet capable of stopping them. We are asking, we are begging, any species capable of aid to answer this call. We do not know if help exists. We only know that if it does not come, we will not survive to send this message again." The signal went out into the void, bouncing between relay beacons, crossing distances that light itself needed years to cross. Most of the assembly's diplomats expected silence. Many species would ignore a call from a dying civilization that offered nothing in return but gratitude. A few species might send token aid, a handful of ships too little and too late to matter. No one expected an answer from the world marked Do Not Contact. 90 light-years away, in a small, unremarkable solar system, the signal reached a listening station buried beneath a mountain range on the human homeworld. The station was part of a global array humanity had built quietly over decades, not because they expected first contact, but because a species that had learned, over and over, through its own bloody history, that the worst disasters always arrive faster than anyone is ready for. A junior technician named Priya Anand was the first to notice the anomaly. She was 26 years old, 3 months into the job, and mostly used to flagging false positives, solar interference, old satellite debris, the occasional excited amateur astronomer's misfire. This was different. The signal was structured, layered. It repeated in patterns that looked deliberately built to be understood by something that had never heard the language before. She sat frozen for 11 seconds, staring at the readout, before she picked up the phone. "This is Anand, Deep Listening Station 7. I need Director Ose, now." "I think," she stopped, swallowed, and made herself say the words clearly. "I think we just received a message, and I think it's real." Word moved through the station, then through the agency, then upward through channels that had been quietly rehearsed for exactly this kind of moment, for longer than most people realized. By the time the message reached the desk of Fleet Admiral Renata Cole, less than 4 hours had passed since Priya Anand first saw the signal. Cole read the translated text twice. She was 54 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that came from 3 decades spent making decisions no one else wanted to make. She had commanded during the Pacific relief operations after the Meridian earthquake, when entire coastlines vanished underwater in a single night, and human ships had sailed into the wreckage without waiting for orders. She had commanded during the Arctic blackout, when a failing research station's last transmission had been a single word, help, and a rescue team had launched before headquarters even finished debating jurisdiction. She understood, in a way few people in the room with her did, exactly what kind of message this was. "They're not asking for trade," she said finally. "They're not asking for alliance. They're dying, and they're asking whoever is listening to come stand between them and the thing that's killing them." She looked up at the room full of officials, scientists, and military leadership waiting for her recommendation. "I don't need a committee to tell me what that means." There were objections, of course. There always were. Some argued this could be a trap, a first contact scenario, designed to lure humanity into a war that was not theirs. Others argued that humanity barely had ships capable of reaching such a distance, let alone fighting a war at the far edge of known space. A few, quietly, argued that humanity's own history of violence made them the wrong species to answer any call for help, that whoever received this message would regret it. Cole listened to all of it, then she stood. "I've spent my whole career watching people ask whether we should help before they ask whether someone needs it," she said. "I'm done asking the first question." She turned to the communications officer. "Send a response. Keep it short. They don't need speeches right now. They need to know someone heard them." The reply crossed the dark in less time than anyone outside that room would have believed possible. Not months, not years, but hours. It was a single line, stripped of diplomacy, stripped of hesitation, carrying only the thing that mattered. "We're coming. Hold on." On the War Council deck of the Orenthil's Hope, Elder Vashka stared at the translated words for a long moment. Around her, aides and officers exchanged confused glances, checking and rechecking the signal's origin, certain there had been some mistake. No species answered that quickly. No species committed to a war that was not its own without months of debate, treaties, conditions. "Elder," Thessa said slowly. The response came from the Class 7 world, from Earth. Vashka said nothing for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the 4 words glowing on the display. Then, quietly, she said the thing that would later be recorded in assembly histories as the first true understanding of what humanity was. "We asked the galaxy for help," she said, "and the only ones who answered were the ones we were told to fear the most." Somewhere in the endless dark between 2 worlds, a species that had spent generations being warned away from the rest of the galaxy was already moving. Not because it had been asked twice, not because there was profit or glory waiting at the end of the journey, but because somewhere, someone had said the word help, and that had always been enough. News of the reply spread through the Kethrani assembly faster than anyone expected, and it left confusion in its wake wherever it went. Diplomats who had spent decades studying first contact protocol could not explain what they were seeing. Every recorded case of a new species answering a distress call had taken time. Months of internal debate, Careful verification, cautious first steps. This had taken hours. On a smaller assembly vessel trailing behind the main fleet, a Kethrani scholar named Ithaven sat alone in his quarters, rereading the human reply for the 10th time. He was not a soldier, he was a historian, assigned to the fleet to document what would likely be the final chapter of Kethrani civilization, whatever that chapter turned out to be. He had read the Class 7 file on Earth more times than he could count, and none of it matched what he was now looking at. "We're coming. Hold on." 4 words. No conditions. No request for resources in exchange. No demand for territory or technology once the crisis passed. Just a promise, sent by a species the Assembly had spent a century being warned to avoid. He requested access to the full human archive, the one compiled by that long-dead scout who had watched Earth in secret decades ago. Most of the file was exactly what he expected: accounts of wars, weapons, conflicts fought over land, over ideas, over things that seemed, from the outside, almost impossible to understand. Species that fought so much among themselves seemed like the last people who should be trusted with the safety of anyone else. But the deeper he read, the more the picture became strange in a different way. There were records of humans building elaborate emergency systems long before they had any reason to expect visitors from beyond their own sky. Fire departments, search and rescue teams, blood donation networks, disaster relief organizations that crossed their own political borders to help people who were, by every human definition, strangers and sometimes enemies. There were accounts of humans risking their lives and losing them to save people they had never met and would gain nothing from saving. One entry, near the end of the file, caught his attention completely. It was a transcript from a human radio broadcast recorded decades earlier, during what the file called the Meridian Earthquake Response. A rescue coordinator, speaking to reporters after operations concluded, had said something that the original scout had flagged as important enough to translate word for word. "People ask us why we go into buildings that are still collapsing, why we sail into storms other ships are running from. I don't have a clever answer. We go because someone is in there. That's the whole reason. That's always been the whole reason." Ithaven sat with that for a long time. Meanwhile, on Earth, the response to the Kethrani signal had triggered something that looked, from the outside, like chaos, but was in fact closer to the opposite. Fleet Admiral Renata Cole had spent decades preparing for a moment she privately doubted would ever come, and now that it had, the machinery she had helped build for it began moving with a speed that startled even the people who had built it alongside her. Humanity's deep space fleet was small by any galactic standard, a scattering of exploration vessels, a handful of experimental warships built more for asteroid defense than interstellar combat, and a fleet of long-haul transport and relief ships originally designed for humanitarian missions between colonies within their own solar system. None of it had been built with an alien war in mind. All of it was about to be repurposed for exactly that. "We don't have the numbers to fight a war of attrition," said Fleet Captain Marcus Reyes, standing beside Cole in the command center, as technical crews swarmed the shipyards on the display screens behind them. "If the Voraxis swarm is even half as dangerous as this signal suggests, we're going to be outnumbered the moment we arrive." "Then we don't fight the war they expect us to fight," Cole said. "We've never had the luxury of matching an enemy ship for ship, gun for gun. We've always had to be smarter about it. That hasn't changed just because the enemy isn't human anymore." Across the shipyards, engineers worked through the night, retrofitting relief vessels with makeshift defensive systems. Weapons technicians pulled experimental railgun prototypes out of testing labs, years ahead of their intended deployment date. Volunteers, actual volunteers, soldiers and civilians alike, lined up by the thousands once the story reached the public, even in its heavily redacted form. Governments that rarely agreed on anything found themselves, for the first time in living memory, moving in the same direction at the same time. It was not perfect. It was not calm. There were arguments in high offices about resources, about risk, about whether humanity's first true contact with an alien species should be a war it did not start. But underneath all of it ran a current that Cole had seen before, in smaller disasters, in smaller wars. The particular, stubborn human instinct to move first and calculate the cost later. Back aboard the Orenthil's Hope, Elder Vashka called a private session with her closest advisors to discuss what she had learned about the species now speeding toward them across the dark. The mood in the room was tense, caught between desperate gratitude and old, ingrained fear. "We do not know what we are inviting into our system," said one advisor, an elder named Corvain, his voice tight. "The Class 7 designation exists for a reason. If these humans are as dangerous as the old records suggest, we may be trading one threat for another." "They are not the threat, Corvain," Vashka said. "The swarm is the threat. We are dying regardless of who answers our call. The only question that matters now is whether anyone will answer it in time. And if they cannot be controlled once they arrive? If they see our weakness and decide to take rather than help." It was Ithhaven who answered, his voice quiet but certain in a way that surprised even himself. "With respect, Elder Corvain, I have spent the last day reading everything the Assembly has ever recorded about this species. They are violent among themselves, yes, that much is true, but every account I have found of humans encountering a being in danger, any being, including species entirely unlike themselves, ends the same way. They help, not because they are asked twice, not because they are paid. They simply do not seem to know how to walk away from someone who is drowning." The room fell silent. "That is either the most reassuring thing I have heard in 3 years," Corvain said eventually, "or the most alarming." "Perhaps," Ithhaven said. "It can be both." Days passed, as the human fleet made its final preparations, and updates continued to move between the two species, faster than either side's official protocols accounted for. The Kethrani began sharing tactical data on the Voraxis swarm, its hive mind coordination, its feeding patterns, the terrifying way it seemed to learn and adapt from every battle it survived. Human analysts on Earth pored over the data around the clock, building simulations, testing strategies, preparing not just weapons but plans. One night, deep into this preparation, Priya Anand, the young technician who had first detected the Kethrani signal, found herself still at her station long after her shift should have ended, watching real-time updates scroll across her screen as the human fleet's final launch sequence approached. A senior officer passing through the station noticed her and paused. "You're the one who caught the signal," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. You did good work." He looked at the screen, at the countdown ticking steadily toward 0, at the names of ships preparing to leave orbit and travel farther from Earth than any human vessel ever had. "Scared?" Priya considered the question honestly before answering. "A little," she admitted. "Mostly I keep thinking about the message, what it must have felt like to send something like that into the dark, not knowing if anyone was even listening." The officer nodded slowly. "And now they know someone was." Far above them, in orbit around a planet that had never before sent its people beyond its own solar system, the human fleet completed its final systems checks. Ships bearing names drawn from old maritime traditions, vessels meant to carry rescue teams to disaster zones now carrying soldiers instead, aligned in formation as their engines powered toward full output. Fleet Admiral Renata Cole stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Meridian's Answer, watching the stars ahead of her with the same stillness she had carried through every crisis of her career. Somewhere far beyond those stars, a species she had never met, on a world she would likely never see with her own eyes outside of a view screen, was still holding on, still counting down the days until either help arrived or it did not. "Status," she said quietly. "All ships report ready, Admiral," came the reply. "Transit window opens in 90 seconds. Cole allowed herself a single breath before she gave the order that would carry humanity, for the first time, into a war that was not its own. "Then let's not keep them waiting any longer than we already have," she said. "Take us out." The fleet moved. Behind it, Earth grew small, and then vanished entirely, swallowed by the dark. Ahead of it, 90 light-years away, a dying world kept counting the hours, no longer certain whether it was counting down to rescue or to ruin. Only certain, now, that for the first time since the swarm had begun its slow and terrible march across the stars, someone was coming who did not intend to turn back. The journey from Earth to Ketharai would take the human fleet 11 days, using their fastest transit drives, a length of time that felt impossibly long to the crews aboard, and impossibly short to the historians, who understood exactly how far humanity had never traveled before. No human ship had ever crossed such a distance. No human eyes had ever expected to see the things they were about to see. And yet, from the moment the fleet entered transit, the mood aboard the ships was less like fear and more like grim, focused determination. the same mood Fleet Admiral Renata Cole had seen in disaster response teams her entire career. Ithaven, still attached to the Kethrani delegation, monitoring the human fleet's approach, was given rare permission to observe the humans directly through a shared communications link established between the two fleets. What he found, over those 11 days, did not match the sealed files at all. He watched Fleet Captain Marcus Reyes run drills late into the ship's night cycle, refusing to let exhausted crews rest until contingency plans were rehearsed, until they were second nature. He watched young soldiers barely out of what humans called their teenage years write letters home that they hoped, quietly, they would live to send. He watched medical teams triple-check emergency supplies meant for alien physiology they had never studied firsthand, working from data the Kethrani had rushed to them in the days before departure. And he watched them laugh. That was the part that unsettled him most, in a strange way. In the middle of preparing for a war against a species capable of consuming entire worlds, human soldiers still made jokes in the mess hall, still played games to pass idle hours, still checked on each other with small, ordinary kindnesses that seemed completely unconnected to the horror waiting at the end of their journey. "You find this confusing," Fleet Admiral Cole said to him one evening, during one of the increasingly frequent conversations the two had struck up over the shared communications link. She had noticed him watching, and unlike most humans he had observed in assembly archives, she addressed the observation directly instead of pretending not to notice it. "I confess that I do," Ithaven said. "Your species is approaching a battle that could end all of your lives, against an enemy you have never faced before, in defense of a world you have never seen. And yet your crews behave as though this were an ordinary voyage." Cole considered this for a moment before answering. "Where I come from, we've learned that if you let the fear take over completely, you stop being useful to the people who need you. So we don't pretend the fear isn't there. We just don't let it run the ship." She paused. "Can I ask you something in return?" "Of course. Your assembly marked us, do not contact. I've read the files your diplomats shared with us, once they realized we were already committed to helping. Violent, unstable, unfit for first contact." She said the words without bitterness, simply stating them. "I'd like to understand why, if you're willing to tell me." Ithaven hesitated, unused to being asked to explain something so uncomfortable so directly. "The truth is complicated," he said finally. "Our scouts observed your species from a distance for decades before any formal contact was considered. What they found troubled them deeply. Your history is filled with war, not war against outside threats, as most spacefaring species eventually experience, but war against yourselves, nation against nation, group against group, sometimes for centuries at a time, over differences that from the outside seemed impossible to fully understand." "That's fair," Cole said. "We've done terrible things to each other. I won't pretend otherwise." "And yet," Ithaven continued, "the same reports that documented your wars also documented something else, something the Assembly's analysts never fully knew what to do with. Whenever disaster struck, an earthquake, a flood, a famine, an accident, your species responded not with the same violence you turned on each other, but with an almost instinctive drive to help. Strangers running toward danger, nations that were enemies sending aid to each other's disaster zones. It did not fit neatly into any category our analysts understood, so the Assembly, faced with a species it could not categorize, and therefore could not predict, chose the safest option available. It chose to stay away." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I think I understand that decision, even if I don't love it," she said eventually. "We've made the same mistake plenty of times ourselves, deciding something is too dangerous to understand, so we just avoid it instead. It's easier than doing the harder work of actually learning why it is the way it is." "May I ask you something in turn?" Ithaven said. "Go ahead. Why are you doing this? Truly, your government debated the decision, I am told, and there were those who argued against it. The risk, the distance, the cost. And yet here you are, 11 days from a war that is not yours, for a species you have never met, on the word of a single distress signal." He leaned forward slightly. "What do you gain from this?" Cole was silent long enough that Ithaven wondered if the connection had failed. When she finally answered, her voice was quieter than before. "Nothing," she said. "That's the honest answer. We don't gain anything from this, that we couldn't have gained more safely by staying home and pretending we never heard the signal." I could give you a longer answer about strategy, about the value of alliances, about what it might mean for humanity's future if we're the first species to reach out instead of the last. All of that would even be true, a little, but it's not the real reason. Somewhere out there, your people are dying, and they ask for help, Cole said simply. I don't need a better reason than that. I've never needed a better reason than that. Neither has anyone on this fleet, or they wouldn't be here. Ithaven found he had no response prepared for this. He had spent his career documenting the calculations of civilizations, the weighing of costs and benefits, the negotiations, the treaties built on mutual gain. He had no framework for a fleet that had crossed an unfathomable distance toward almost certain danger, expecting nothing in return beyond the simple fact of having helped. Over the following days, as the fleet drew closer to HFY, Ithaven requested and received permission to speak with other members of the human crew, gathering accounts for the historical record he still felt responsible for keeping, whatever the outcome of the coming battle. He spoke with Priya Anand, transferred to the fleet's communications team after her discovery of the original signal, who told him quietly that she thought about the desperation in that first message every single day, and that it was the reason she had volunteered for the mission instead of staying safely on Earth. He spoke with a young medic named Diego Alvarez, barely 22 years old, who admitted he was frightened, but said the fear did not change what he intended to do once the fighting started. You don't get to choose whether you're scared, Diego told him. You only get to choose what you do while you're scared. My grandmother used to say that. She said it about a lot smaller things than this, but I think it still applies. He spoke with Fleet Captain Reyes, who told him bluntly that humanity's history of war, the very history that had frightened the Assembly for so long, was also the reason humanity might actually be able to help. We've spent our whole history learning how to fight, unfortunately, Reyes said. Most species that build peaceful civilizations never have to learn that. It's cost us more than I can put into words, but it means that when something like this comes along, something that actually deserves fighting, we're not starting from nothing. By the 10th day of the journey, Ithaven had begun compiling notes for what he privately thought of as a new file, one that would replace the sealed and outdated Class 7 record the Assembly had relied on for a century. He did not yet know how the coming battle would end. He did not know whether the fleet now speeding toward his dying homeworld would be enough to turn back a threat that had already devoured a dozen worlds before it. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that whatever the old files had said about humanity, they had missed something essential. They had counted the wars and called it the whole story. They had never accounted for the 11 days he had just spent watching a fleet of strangers cross the galaxy, for people they had never met, for reasons that came down, in the end, to nothing more complicated than someone had asked, and they had not been able to say no. On the 11th day, as the fleet approached the final transit point that would bring them within sight of HFY, Fleet Admiral Cole gathered her crews for a final briefing. Her voice, carried across every ship in the fleet, was steady in the way Ithaven had come to recognize as distinctly, stubbornly human. 11 days ago, a signal reached our homeworld, she said. It didn't ask for trade. It didn't ask for territory. It asked for help from people who had every reason to expect that no one was listening. We heard it. We're here. She paused, and even through the communications link, Ithaven could feel the weight settle over every ship in the fleet. Somewhere ahead of us, people are still holding on, waiting to find out if that message meant anything. Let's make sure it did. The human fleet dropped out of transit above HFY on what the Kethrani defenders had privately begun to call the last morning. Though no one had said the words aloud, the planet below was still alive, still holding, but barely. Its orbital shields flickered in and out as they strained against the outer edge of the Voraxis swarm's advance force, and its remaining defense fleet, what little was left of it, hung in ragged formation between the planet and the enemy, waiting for an ending they had stopped believing could be anything other than final. Then the sky changed. Sensor operators aboard the Orenthil's Hope watched in confused silence as dozens of new signatures bloomed into existence at the edge of the system, vessels unlike anything in the Assembly's database, arranged in formations that looked deliberate, practiced, calm. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a young sensor technician broke the silence with a single disbelieving word. They're here. Elder Vashka stood at the command display, watching the human fleet arrange itself between the planet and the incoming swarm with the same steady, unhurried precision Ithaven had described from his time observing them during transit. There was no hesitation in the formation, no scattered confusion of a fleet still deciding what to do. They moved as though they had already fought this battle 100 times in simulation, because in truth, they had. Aboard the Meridian's Answer, Fleet Admiral Renata Cole studied the tactical display with the same stillness that had carried her through every crisis of her career. The Voraxis swarm's advance force filled the screen. Not organized ships in the way humanity understood the term, but a vast, shifting mass of biological and mechanical hybrid vessels, moving with the eerie, perfect coordination of a single mind controlling 1,000 bodies. "That's the hive mind coordination the Kethrani warned us about," said Fleet Captain Marcus Reyes, standing at her side. "Every vessel in that swarm is receiving the same commands in real time. No individual initiative, no independent decision-making. It reacts as one organism." "Which means it has a weakness," Cole said. "Ma'am? Anything that moves as one thing can be predicted as one thing. It's never had to think for itself, because it's never needed to. It's fought scattered, disorganized defenders for 1,000 years, and won every time." She studied the shifting mass on the screen. It's never fought something that adapts faster than it can react. The Kethrani command staff, watching the exchange over the shared communications link, found themselves holding a strange, fragile new kind of hope. It was Ithaven, standing quietly at the edge of the War Council deck, who finally gave voice to what many of them were thinking. "They are not afraid," he said softly. "They are human," Elder Vashka replied. "I am beginning to understand that fear, for them, is something they carry alongside their duty, not something that replaces it." The battle began without ceremony. The Voraxis swarm's advance force surged forward the moment it registered the new arrivals, its collective intelligence calculating the human fleet as simply more biomass to consume, more resources to fold into its endless hunger. It had faced dozens of species over its long, terrible history, and every one of them had eventually fought the same way. Concentrated force meeting concentrated force, until one side was consumed entirely. The human fleet did not fight that way. Ships that the swarm's coordinating intelligence had already calculated as primary targets suddenly scattered into smaller formations, breaking apart the predictable mass the swarm expected to consume in a single coordinated strike. Where the swarm surged to fill the gap, it found itself pulled into pockets of concentrated human firepower, ambushed by vessels that had deliberately made themselves look weaker and more disorganized than they actually were. "They're using deception," Elder Corvain said, watching the tactical display with something between disbelief and awe. "The swarm has never faced an enemy that deliberately misrepresents its own formation. It has never needed to," Ithaven murmured. "No one has ever survived long enough to learn how." Aboard the Meridian's Answer, Cole watched the first exchanges unfold exactly as her tactical teams had modeled during the long transit from Earth. The swarm reacted predictably, its single controlling intelligence unable to account for tactics built specifically to exploit the weaknesses of collective, centralized thinking. Where a human commander might have hesitated, second-guessed, waited for confirmation, the swarm's hive mind simply reacted according to patterns it had relied on for 1,000 years. Patterns the human fleet had spent 11 days studying and preparing to break. "Formation Halloway is holding," reported a communications officer. "Enemy forces pulling into the kill zone as projected. Casualties? 2 frigates damaged, no losses yet." Cole allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief, though she did not let it show on her face. The battle was far from over, and she knew better than most that early success in any engagement meant little once an enemy began to adapt. The Voraxis swarm had survived and grown for 1,000 years precisely because it learned quickly, even without individual initiative among its component vessels. Somewhere in its vast, distributed intelligence, it would begin recalculating, adjusting, searching for a way to counter tactics it had never encountered before. It did not take long. Nearly an hour into the engagement, the swarm's advance force shifted its approach, abandoning its initial pattern of concentrated assault, and instead spreading itself into a wider formation, attempting to surround the scattered human ships rather than allow itself to be drawn into further ambushes. It was, Ithaven realized as he watched the tactical display shift, a form of learning, crude, mechanical, but real. The swarm had adjusted in less than an hour, to a tactic no enemy had ever used against it before. "They're adapting," Corvain said, alarm creeping into his voice. "How is that possible?" The Assembly's own analysis suggested the hive mind's learning speed was faster than we accounted for, Vashka finished grimly. "We are not the only ones capable of surprises today." Aboard the Meridian's answer, the shift in the swarm's formation triggered immediate response from the human command staff. Cole studied the new pattern for only a few seconds before issuing new orders, her voice calm despite the sudden change in the battle's shape. "They're trying to encircle Formation Halloway," she said. "Pull them back to the secondary line and bring the Kethrani defense fleet into the gap. If we're going to win this, it's not going to be with our ships alone." The order was relayed to Fleet Commander Thessa, who had spent the opening phase of the battle watching in stunned silence as the human tactics unfolded exactly as Cole had described during the brief joint strategy sessions in the days before the engagement. Thessa had agreed to the plan then, out of desperation, more than confidence. Now, watching it succeed in real time, something in her began to shift. "All remaining Kethrani vessels, advance to coordinates provided by the human fleet," she ordered, her voice steadier than it had been in months. "We fight beside them, not behind them." The combined fleets closed the gap the swarm had attempted to exploit, and for the first time since the war began, the Vorax's swarm's advance force found itself caught between two coordinated defensive lines, instead of one exhausted, retreating one. The hive mind's calculations, built on 1,000 years of consuming scattered, disorganized resistance, had no ready answer for an enemy that adapted its alliances as quickly as its tactics. The battle raged for 6 hours, before the swarm's advance force finally broke formation and withdrew, retreating toward the larger mass of the swarm still gathering at the edge of the system. It was not a full victory. Both sides understood that the true test was still to come when the swarm's main body arrived in full force, but it was, undeniably, the first time in 3 years that the Kethrani Assembly had won anything at all. Aboard the Orenthil's Hope, the War Council deck fell into stunned, exhausted silence as the tactical display confirmed the swarm's retreat. Elder Vashka stood motionless for a long moment before finally allowing herself to sit, the weight of 3 years of loss settling differently now that it had, for the first time, been interrupted by something other than defeat. "Casualty reports," she said quietly. "Human fleet reports 12 vessels damaged, 3 lost," came the reply. "Kethrani fleet reports similar losses, though significantly reduced from projected estimates, based on our own tactical models." Vashka absorbed the numbers in silence. People had died today. Humans who had crossed the galaxy for a world that was not theirs, who had known the risk and come anyway, and some of whom would never see their homeworld again. The cost was real, and she would not let herself forget it. Ithaven found himself standing at the observation window, looking out at the darkened space where the battle had raged only hours before, now littered with wreckage from both fleets. Somewhere out there, human ships were already beginning recovery operations, pulling their own wounded from damaged vessels alongside Kethrani crews who had never expected to see this kind of coordination between species so different from one another. "They did not have to come," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone listening. "And now some of them will never leave." Behind him, Elder Vashka's voice was steady, though something in it had changed since the battle began. "No," she agreed. "They did not have to come, and yet they did." She looked out at the wreckage, at the first victory the Assembly had claimed in 3 long years of loss. "I do not think we will ever fully understand this species, Ithaven, but I no longer believe we were right to fear them." Far above the battered surface of Ketharai, the human fleet regrouped, tending its wounded, counting its losses, and preparing for the greater battle still to come. The Vorax's swarm's main body was still weeks away, still vast beyond anything the combined fleets had yet faced. But for the first time since the war began, the people of Ketharai went to sleep that night, believing, however cautiously, that they might actually survive to see it end. Victory, Fleet Admiral Renata Cole had learned long ago, was rarely as clean as it looked from a command deck. The retreat of the Vorax's swarm's advance force bought Ketharai time, but time was all it bought, and everyone on both sides understood that the true test still lay ahead. The swarm's main body, the vast, ancient mass that had consumed a dozen worlds before it ever reached the Kethrani Assembly, was still coming, and it was larger, and hungrier than anything the combined fleets had yet faced. In the days following the first battle, the human and Kethrani fleets worked side by side to prepare, and it was in those quiet, exhausting days between battles that Ithavan began to understand something about humanity that no file, no archive, no scout's report had ever fully captured. He watched human medical teams work through the night alongside Kethrani physicians, learning alien anatomy on the fly from hastily shared data, treating wounded from both fleets without pause or hesitation over which patients belonged to which species. He watched engineers from both fleets argue for hours over ship repairs, communicating through imperfect translation software, growing frustrated, and somehow still finding ways to understand each other by the end of it. He watched, most of all, the quiet moments. A human soldier sharing rations with a Kethrani crew member who had lost everything when her homeworld colony fell silent years earlier, simply because she looked like she needed someone to sit with her. It was during one of these quiet moments that Ithavan met Diego Alvarez again, the young medic he had spoken with during the fleet's transit from Earth. Diego was sitting alone in the Meridian's Answer's small observation lounge, staring out at the wreckage still being cleared from the previous battle, when Ithavan approached. "May I join you?" Ithavan asked. Diego gestured to the seat beside him, without looking away from the window. "Sure." They sat in silence for a while, before Ithavan spoke again. "You lost someone in the battle." It wasn't a question, and Diego didn't treat it like one. "Corporal Reyes," he said quietly. "No relation to the captain. Different family. He was 23. I treated him after the first wave of fighting. Thought he was going to make it." He shook his head slowly. "He didn't." "I am sorry," Ithavan said, and meant it more than he expected to. "Yeah." Diego was quiet for a long moment. "You know what's strange? I keep thinking about the message, the one that started all this. We're coming. Hold on. I keep thinking about whoever was on the other end of that signal, waiting to find out if anyone was going to answer." He finally looked over at Ithavan. "Was it you? On your side, I mean. Were you one of the people waiting?" "I was aboard this fleet before your arrival. Yes," Ithavan said. "Though I was fortunate enough not to be among those most directly threatened, others were not so fortunate." "Then it was worth it," Diego said simply. Reyes would have said the same thing. He wasn't the kind of person who needed a bigger reason than that. He turned back to the window. "Neither am I guess." Ithavan found himself without words for a long moment, turning the young medic's simple certainty over in his mind. He had spent a career studying civilizations that calculated the cost of every action against its potential benefit, weighing losses against gains with careful, deliberate precision. He had never encountered anything quite like the particular, uncomplicated conviction he kept finding among the humans he spoke with. A conviction that the cost of helping, however high, was simply not the question that mattered most. The true test came 9 days later. The Voraxis swarm's main body arrived at the edge of the HFY system in a formation that dwarfed anything the combined fleets had faced before. A vast, shifting mass of biological and mechanical hybrid vessels stretching across sensor readings in numbers that made even Fleet Admiral Cole's carefully composed expression falter, if only for a moment. "Sweet Christ," murmured Fleet Captain Reyes, staring at the tactical display. "That's not an advance force. That's the whole thing." "Confirmed," came the report from the sensor station. "Estimated vessel count exceeds our own combined fleet by a factor of 6, possibly more. The readings are still resolving." Cole studied the overwhelming numbers on the display for a long moment, before turning to her staff. "Then we don't fight it as one battle," she said. "We fight it as 100 small ones, and we make sure every single one favors us." The battle that followed would later be recorded, in both human and Kethrani histories, as the longest and costliest engagement either species had fought. It stretched across 3 days without meaningful pause, waves of Voraxis vessels crashing against the combined human and Kethrani defense lines in relentless, grinding assaults that tested every tactic, every reserve, every ounce of endurance both fleets possessed. The cost was brutal. On the second day, an entire human formation, 17 ships strong, was cut off from the main fleet while covering the evacuation of a Kethrani orbital station that had come under direct assault. Fleet Captain Reyes, commanding the formation personally, made the decision to hold position rather than retreat, buying time for the last evacuation shuttles to clear the station, even as Voraxis vessels closed in from 3 directions. "Captain," "You need to fall back," came the order from the Meridian's answer, Cole's voice carrying an urgency rare for her. "You're going to be overrun." "Negative," Reyes replied, his voice steady, despite the chaos audible behind him. "Evacuation shuttles report 40 more seconds needed to clear the station. We hold until they're clear." "Marcus." 40 seconds, Admiral. We can give them 40 seconds. A pause, filled with the sound of alarms and impacts. They didn't leave anyone behind when they called for help. We're not leaving anyone behind now. The shuttles cleared the station, with 6 seconds to spare. Of the 17 ships in Reyes's formation, 9 survived the retreat that followed. Reyes's own vessel was among them, badly damaged but intact, and when the wreckage was later cleared, the crews of the station he had died protecting. No, Ithaven corrected himself upon hearing the reports. Not died, survived, though it had been close enough that the distinction felt fragile. Found themselves struggling to understand a decision that had cost so much for people who were, by every reasonable measure, still strangers to the humans who had saved them. Ithaven, watching the battle unfold from the Orenthil's Hope's War Council deck, found himself thinking often of the words Diego Alvarez had spoken days earlier. He wasn't the kind of person who needed a bigger reason than that. It was a sentiment he had now seen echoed across the entire human fleet, in decision after decision, that made little sense by the calculations the Assembly had always relied upon, and perfect sense by some other measure Ithaven was only beginning to understand. By the third day, the Varaxis swarm's main body had suffered losses far beyond anything it had experienced in its 1,000-year history of conquest, but it had not yet broken. Its vast numbers still pressed against the combined fleet's exhausted defensive lines, and both human and Kethrani commanders understood that a war of pure attrition, however costly to the swarm, would eventually favor the side with greater numbers to spend. And the swarm still had numbers the combined fleet could not hope to match. "We can't win this by simply outlasting them," Cole said, during an emergency strategy session with Elder Vashka and Fleet Commander Thessa. Exhaustion evident in every line of her face after 3 days, without meaningful rest. "Every hour we hold is another hour they can afford to spend, and we can't." "Then what do you propose?" Vashka asked. Cole studied the tactical data one more time, her mind working through the swarm's hive-mind coordination, the way she had studied it during the long transit from Earth, searching for the single point where 1,000 years of overwhelming numbers might finally have a weakness. The Kethrani analysis suggests the entire swarm operates from a central coordinating node, correct? A single point of command that directs every vessel in the formation? "That has always been our understanding," Thessa said. "Though the node itself has never been located precisely. It moves within the swarm's central mass, protected by the densest concentration of vessels in the entire formation." "Then that's where we go," Cole said quietly. "Not around the swarm, not through the edges of it. We go straight for the heart, and we cut it out before it has a chance to grind us down through sheer numbers." Vashka studied the human admiral's face for a long moment, seeing in it the same stillness, the same unwavering resolve that Ithaven had described from his time observing the fleet during transit. It was a plan that would cost more lives, human and Kethrani both. It was also, she understood, likely the only plan that offered any real chance of ending the war before the swarm's numbers simply overwhelmed them regardless of tactics. "It will be dangerous beyond anything either fleet has yet attempted," Vashka said. "Elder," Cole replied, "we crossed 90 light-years because your people asked us to hold a line no one thought we could hold. I don't intend to stop being dangerous now, when it matters more than it ever has." Outside the War Council deck's viewport, the battle continued to rage, wave after wave of Varaxis vessels crashing against defensive lines that had already given more than anyone had expected them to give. Somewhere in the heart of that vast, hungry mass, a single coordinating intelligence continued directing 1,000 years of conquest, unaware that the 2 fleets it now faced were preparing something it had never encountered in all its long, terrible history. An enemy willing to pay any price to end the war in a single, decisive strike, rather than simply survive to fight another day. The plan Fleet Admiral Renata Cole proposed was, by any conventional military standard, close to reckless. It required locating a target that had never been precisely identified, driving a strike force through the densest concentration of enemy vessels in the entire Varaxis swarm, and doing so with fleets already exhausted from 3 days of continuous combat. Fleet Commander Thessa said as much during the final planning session. though not as an objection, so much as an acknowledgement of the stakes. If this fails, Thessa said, studying the tactical projections laid out before the Joint Command Staff, we will have spent our remaining strength on a single strike, with nothing left to fall back on. The swarm's numbers will simply grind down whatever remains of both fleets. If we don't try it, Cole replied, the swarm's numbers will grind down whatever remains of both fleets regardless, just more slowly. At least this way, we choose how the fight ends, instead of waiting to find out. Elder Vashka, presiding over the session with the weight of 3 years of loss still visible in her posture, looked to Ithhaven, who had been quietly compiling data from both fleets' intelligence teams throughout the planning process. You have been studying the swarm's coordination patterns as closely as anyone in this fleet, human or Kethrani both. Do you believe the human plan can work? Ithhaven considered the question carefully before answering. The swarm has never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice its own strength for a single decisive strike, he said. Every species it has consumed fought to preserve itself, to survive as long as possible. The humans propose the opposite, a strategy built entirely around ending the war quickly, regardless of the cost to themselves. It is, I believe, exactly the kind of strategy the swarm's coordinating intelligence has never had to account for. That is not the same as saying it will succeed, Vashka said. No, Ithhaven agreed, but I have watched this fleet make impossible decisions since the day their first message reached us, Elder. I have learned not to assume their plans will fail, simply because they defy the calculations the rest of us would make. The final plan, worked out over hours of joint strategy sessions between human and Kethrani commanders, hinged on a tactic Cole had proposed early in the discussions, and refined with input from both fleets' technical teams. A decoy formation, built primarily from older, outdated human vessels no longer considered frontline combat ships, would launch a direct, highly visible assault toward the swarm's central mass, drawing the bulk of its defensive response. While the swarm's coordinating intelligence redirected its forces to meet the obvious threat, a smaller, faster strike force, composed of the fleet's most advanced vessels and volunteer crews from both species, would attempt to slip through the resulting gap in the swarm's formation and strike directly at the coordinating node itself, wherever within the central mass it was ultimately located. It is, in essence, the same tactic that won us the first battle, Cole explained to the assembled crews during the final briefing before the strike. We make ourselves look like exactly what the enemy expects, and then we make sure the real threat is somewhere else entirely. The difference is the stakes. This isn't a battle we're trying to win on points. This is the one that ends the war, one way or another. Volunteers for the decoy formation were not difficult to find, despite the near certainty that the ships involved would suffer catastrophic losses, drawing the swarm's attention away from the true strike force. Fleet Captain Reyes, still recovering from injuries sustained during the third day of fighting, requested command of the formation personally, a request Cole approved only after a long, difficult conversation held privately between the two of them. You don't have to do this, Marcus, Cole said. You've already given enough. No one would think less of you for sitting this one out. With respect, Admiral, that's not really the point, is it? Reyes said. Somebody has to fly those ships into the center of that formation and make the swarm believe it's looking at a real threat. I know these crews. I know what they're capable of, and I know what it's going to cost them. I'm not going to ask anyone to do that without being there myself. Cole studied his face for a long moment, seeing in it the same stubborn, unshakable resolve she had relied on throughout her own career, the same quality she suspected had drawn thousands of volunteers to this mission in the first place. 90 light-years from a homeworld most of them would likely never see again. All right, she said finally. Bring them home if you can, Marcus. I intend to, Reyes said, but if I can't, I intend to make sure it mattered. The strike began at what both fleets had come to call dawn, though there was no true sunrise in the cold dark of space above Ketharai, only the shared agreement among exhausted crews that a new day had begun, and with it, perhaps, an ending to the war that had cost so much already. The decoy formation, 30 aging vessels crewed entirely by volunteers who understood exactly what they were being asked to do, launched toward the Voraxis swarm's central mass, in a formation designed to look like exactly the kind of desperate, all-or-nothing assault the swarm's coordinating intelligence had learned to expect from a losing side. The swarm responded exactly as the Joint Command Staff had hoped, its vast, coordinated mass shifting to meet the obvious threat. thousands of vessels redirecting their attention toward the decoy formation, with the same relentless, predictable efficiency that had allowed the hive mind to consume a dozen worlds before this one. For nearly 20 minutes, Reyes's formation held against the closing wall of Voraxis vessels, weaving through attack patterns, buying every additional second the strike force needed to find its opening. Gap identified, came the report from the Meridian's Answers tactical station, watching the swarm's formation shift in real time as the decoy assault drew its defensive response further and further from the central mass. Strike force has a clear approach vector, window estimated at 90 seconds before the swarm's formation adjusts. Send them, Cole said. The strike force, 12 of the combined fleet's fastest and most heavily modified vessels, surged through the gap in the Voraxis formation, driving directly toward the dense, shifting heart of the swarm's central mass, where the coordinating node was believed to be located. Ithaven, watching from the Orenthil's Hope's War Council deck, found himself holding a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, watching 12 small ships disappear into a formation that dwarfed them beyond any reasonable comparison. Behind them, Reyes's decoy formation continued to hold, though at a cost that grew more visible with every passing minute. Ship after ship fell silent on the tactical display, their crews either lost or, in the best cases, adrift and awaiting rescue that could not yet reach them through the ongoing chaos of battle. Reyes's own vessel took heavy damage twice, and each time, against the urging of his own crew, he refused to withdraw, holding the formation's position long enough to keep the swarm's attention fixed exactly where it needed to be. 90 seconds, came the report from the strike force. Approaching central mass. Sensor readings suggest coordinating node signature, approximately 200 kilometers ahead. Copy that, replied the strike force's lead pilot, a young human officer named Captain Sarah Okonkwo, her voice tight with concentration, as she guided her formation through a labyrinth of Voraxis vessels that had not yet fully registered the true nature of the threat now moving through their center. All ships, weapons hot. We only get one shot at this. The strike force broke through the final layer of the swarm's defensive formation, with less than a minute of the projected window remaining, emerging into a clear stretch of space at the heart of the vast, hungry mass, where a single, massive vessel, larger than anything either fleet had yet encountered, pulsed with the unmistakable signature of concentrated biological and mechanical processing power. Coordinating node confirmed, Okonkwo reported. All ships, converge fire on my mark. The strike that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, 12 vessels concentrating every weapon they carried on a single, massive target that had never, in 1,000 years of conquest, faced a direct assault against its own coordinating intelligence. The node's defensive systems, designed to repel scattered, disorganized attacks from species that had never understood the true structure of the threat they faced, buckled under the concentrated, deliberate strike in a way nothing in the swarm's long history had prepared it for. Then, across the entire battlefield, the Voraxis swarm's coordinated formation began to fall apart. Without the central node's guidance, the thousands of vessels that had moved as a single, terrible organism throughout the entire war suddenly found themselves reduced to disconnected, disorganized fragments, each one acting on residual, outdated commands with no coordinating intelligence left to direct them. The relentless, predictable efficiency that had allowed the swarm to consume a dozen worlds collapsed within minutes into chaos, fragments of the once unified formation scattering, faltering, becoming, for the first time in the war, simply killable. Aboard the Meridian's Answer, the tactical display shifted so dramatically that for a moment, no one spoke at all, the entire command deck watching in stunned silence, as 3 years of relentless Kethrani losses, finally, impossibly, began to turn in the other direction. The node is down, came the confirmation from Okonkwo's strike force, her voice carrying an exhaustion that mixed with something close to disbelief. Swarm coordination confirmed disrupted across the entire formation. Repeat, the node is down. Elder Vashka, watching from the Orenthil's Hope, felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 3 long years, though she did not yet allow herself to call it relief, not with the battle still far from over. Beside her, Ithaven stared at the shifting tactical display with an expression he could not fully name, watching the impossible strategy of a species he had spent weeks trying to understand succeed exactly as its architect had promised it would. They did it, Corvain said quietly. disbelief evident in his voice. They actually did it. Yes, Vashka said, watching the scattered remnants of the once unstoppable swarm falter across the battlefield. They did. Far below, in the wreckage of Reyes's battered decoy formation, exhausted crews watched the swarm's coordinated assault collapse around them, and for the first time in 3 days of continuous fighting, allowed themselves to believe that the war they had crossed 90 light-years to fight might actually, finally, be ending. It took another 2 days for the last organized resistance from the shattered Voraxis swarm to be cleared from the space around HFY, its once unified formation reduced to scattered, disconnected fragments that the combined human and Kethrani fleets picked apart with methodical, exhausted efficiency. By the time the final fragment fell silent, both fleets had been fighting nearly continuously for 5 days, and the toll on both sides was severe enough that the celebrations that followed the swarm's defeat were quiet, subdued, more relief than triumph. Fleet Admiral Renata Cole stood on the observation deck of the Meridian's Answer, looking out at the wreckage still drifting through the space above HFY, ships from both fleets moving slowly through the debris field, recovering the wounded, the lost, the pieces of a battle that had cost more than anyone had wanted to pay, even in victory. Fleet Captain Marcus Reyes stood beside her, his arm in a medical brace, his ship, along with what remained of his decoy formation, safely recovered after the swarm's collapse. "We lost a lot of people," Reyes said quietly. "We did," Cole agreed. "We knew we might, going in." "Doesn't make it easier." "No," Cole said, "it never does." She was quiet for a moment, watching the recovery operations continue below. "But there's a whole planet down there that's still alive because of what we did, Marcus. Billions of people who were counting down the days until they didn't exist anymore. That has to matter. I have to believe that matters." Below them, on the surface of HFY, the news of the swarm's defeat spread through cities that had spent 3 years preparing for annihilation, and the response was unlike anything the Kethrani Assembly had experienced in living memory. Streets that had been quiet with fear and exhaustion filled with people who had, until days earlier, genuinely believed they would not survive to see this moment. Many of them, upon learning the details of the battle that had saved them, found themselves struggling to reconcile the species that had rescued their world with the frightening file the Assembly had maintained on humanity for a century. Elder Vashka called a formal session of the Assembly Council within a week of the battle's end, the first such session held since the war against the swarm had begun 3 years earlier. The purpose of the session, listed plainly on the official agenda, was simple, and yet it represented one of the most significant decisions the Assembly had faced in generations: a full review of humanity's Class 7 quarantine status. Haven was called to testify before the Council, given his unique position as the Assembly's primary observer of the human fleet throughout the war. He stood before the assembled elders, many of whom had never met a human directly, and found himself, for the first time in his career as a historian, uncertain how to begin. "I was asked to document what would likely be the final chapter of our civilization," he said finally. "Instead, I have spent the last several weeks documenting something else entirely, and I confess I am still working to fully understand what it is I witnessed." "Tell us plainly then," said one of the elders. "Was the Assembly wrong to fear this species?" Haven considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not believe fear was the wrong response, precisely," he said. "The scouts who first observed humanity were not wrong about what they saw. Humans are capable of terrible violence. Their history contains wars fought over disagreements that, from the outside, can seem almost incomprehensible. That much of the old file was accurate. Then what would you have us believe instead?" "That the old file was accurate and incomplete," Haven said. "It counted every war humanity has ever fought against itself, and called that the whole of what they are. It never accounted for what happens when that same capacity for violence is turned instead toward protecting something, or someone, rather than destroying it. I have now seen both sides of that capacity firsthand. I do not believe we can continue treating the first half as the whole truth, when we have now witnessed the second half save our entire civilization." The debate that followed stretched across 3 full days, elders weighing a century of cautious, careful policy against the reality of what had just occurred above their own homeworld. Some argued that gratitude, however deeply felt, was not sufficient reason to abandon protocols built for the Assembly's long-term safety. Others argued that no protocol built on incomplete information could be trusted to guide future decisions, particularly ones as significant as this. It was Elder Vashka, in the end, who offered the resolution the Council eventually adopted, and her words, recorded in the official Assembly archives, would later be quoted extensively in the revised diplomatic files the Assembly maintained on humanity for generations afterward. "We built the Class 7 designation on a simple question," she said. "Are they safe?" It was, I believe, always the wrong question to ask. Safety is not a fixed quality any civilization possesses. It is a choice, made again and again, in every moment that matters. We do not know, with certainty, what humanity will choose in every future moment. No civilization can promise that of any other, including our own. What we do know, because we have now seen it ourselves, is what they chose when it would have been easiest, and safest, and most reasonable, to choose nothing at all. They chose to come. I do not believe we have the right to call a species unsafe for making that choice. The Council's final decision did not remove humanity from the Assembly's classification system entirely, a step even the most grateful of the elders were not yet prepared to take. Instead, the old, sealed Class 7 file, the one that had labeled humanity unstable and unfit for contact, was formally revised. In its place, the Assembly recorded a new designation, one that would spread quietly through diplomatic channels across the wider galaxy in the months and years that followed, carried by species who had heard, secondhand, the story of what had happened above HFY. Class 7, contact only in true need, species capable of great violence, and, in equal measure, great sacrifice for those they have never met. History suggests they will answer, without condition, when the need is real. History further suggests they should not be asked for less than that. Aboard the Meridian's answer, preparing for the long journey home, Fleet Admiral Renata Cole received a formal transmission from the Assembly Council, informing her of the decision, and extending, on behalf of the entire Kethrani people, a debt of gratitude the Assembly stated plainly it did not know how it could ever fully repay. Cole read the message twice before responding, her reply as brief and unadorned as the message that had started this entire journey 90 light-years and, it now felt, a lifetime ago. "You don't owe us anything. That was never what this was about. Take care of your world. That's the only repayment we ever needed." In the years that followed, the story of humanity's answer to the Kethrani distress signal spread slowly across the galaxy, carried between species who had, for the most part, never given humanity much thought at all. Some treated the story with skepticism, certain it had grown taller with each retelling. Others treated it with quiet, careful curiosity, wondering what kind of species crossed such distances for people they had never met, expecting nothing beyond the simple fact of having helped. On Earth, the return of the fleet was met with a homecoming far larger and more complicated than anyone aboard had fully anticipated. A planet grappling for the first time with the reality that its people were no longer alone in the universe, and that the first thing the wider galaxy had learned about them was not a story of conquest, but of rescue. Priya Anand, who had first detected the Kethrani signal from a quiet listening station buried beneath a mountain range, returned to Earth changed in ways she was still working to understand. She kept, framed on her desk at the station where she continued to work, a printed copy of the very first message she had ever decoded, the desperate plea that had started everything. Beside it, she kept a second printout, the 4 words that had been humanity's answer, sent within hours of that first signal, before anyone truly understood what they were agreeing to. "We're coming. Hold on." She thought, often, about the fact that no one had asked her permission to write those words on humanity's behalf, that a species scattered across a single small planet had somehow managed, across all its wars and all its differences, to answer with something close to a single voice when the moment finally came. She did not fully understand how that had happened. She was not certain anyone did. But she understood, in the quiet certainty she now carried with her every day at the listening station, exactly what would happen the next time a signal like that reached Earth's arrays, carrying nothing but coordinates and a plea from strangers on the other side of the dark. Someone would hear it, and somewhere, humanity would already be getting ready to answer.